Welcome to Republican Roundtable. I'm your host, Max Reimer. It is that time of year again. We are in session. Once again, the legislature gets to figure out how they're going to spend all of our money. On today's show, we have a favorite guest of the show, a friend of mine, Representative Eric Lucero. Eric, thank you for joining us.
Hey, absolutely. Thank you for the invitation to be back.
So we're back in session. I think before we get into that, why don't you tell us, if anybody out there doesn't know who Representative Eric Lucero is, who are you? What is the district you represent? What is your background? That kind of thing, Eric.
Absolutely. Well, I have the privilege of serving the great people of Albertville, St. Michael, Otsego, Hanover, and the Wright County part of Dayton. And I'm presently serving in my third term. I sit on the Public Safety, the Judiciary, and the Higher Education Committee. I'm also a member of the Data Practices and Personal Data Privacy Commission. And some of the things that I'm advocating for, the values and priorities of my community, are pro-Second Amendment. We're a very strong pro-life community. Roads and bridges transportation rather than trolleys and trains. Free market healthcare solutions, tax cuts, and equity and education funding, I would say, are the top 6 issues.
So we're moving into a session this year, and you mentioned all those things, which are great priorities. I think a lot of people in our listening and viewing audience would agree with them. We're moving into another session where you find yourself in the minority, and I'm wondering what that role looks like for somebody like you who is a strong advocate for strong policies. What does that look like for you? What kind of role do you see yourself playing in this session?
Well, my role, my perspective, what I'm fighting for has honestly not changed from the majority to the minority. In the majority, I've been fighting for constitutional principles, the truth of individual liberty, our God-given rights, and prosperity derives from limited government and allowing people to self-determine the outcomes of their own life. I'm fighting for the exact same thing in the minority. Unfortunately, the bills that are brought forward are controlled by the majority, and so what I do on the House floor in committee is simply bring out the truth of what history demonstrates, how their bills are illogical and are going to be destructive to hardworking Minnesota individuals, families, and businesses across Minnesota.
So we just had some news about the actual projected budget, the surplus. It seems like we're going to have another surplus of, I think last time I looked, it was about $1.3 billion.
Correct.
Does that sound right? The principle, I think, stance for conservative is, hey, I think that money should be given back. What do you expect to happen with that big pot of money that they're calling a surplus, which is really an overtaxation in my mind?
Yeah, well, no, you are spot on. A budget surplus is exactly that. It is overtaxation, overconfiscation by government. And $1.3 billion is the projected budget surplus. I believe that's going to go up when the next announcement comes out in March. But add on top of that, add on top of the $1.3 billion, the $300 million currently sitting in the state's cash account, the approximately $2.4 billion sitting in the state's budget reserves, so rainy day fund. If you total those 3 accounts up, we're pushing $4 billion. And that's excess money that the state of Minnesota is sitting on and has overcollected. So yes, absolutely. Because overcollection of tax dollars demonstrates too high of tax, we need to have a tax cut. If you remember, during the Governor Dayton's administration, he increased taxes, the largest in state history, $2 billion, including that adding on a 4th tier to our income tax here in Minnesota. And so because we have such a high sales tax, income tax, property tax, all across the board.
One of the only states in the nation which has all of them.
Yeah, exactly. We definitely need to bring tax relief to businesses. That's what we've seen on a nationwide perspective, is that President Donald Trump and the Republican majority, when they were in both the House and the Senate majorities, they enacted radical, dramatic tax decreases. And we saw the results of what we're currently living in, the economic expansion of historical proportions, stock market highs, unemployment, Black and Hispanic communities, all-time lows, right? It is amazing what tax cuts do. We need to do the same thing here in the state of Minnesota. Unfortunately, radical, metrocentric Democrats stand in the way.
And because they stand in the way, they look at that pot of money as a pot of money that they can use for pet projects and things of that nature. Eric, you find yourself in the position where you and I agree, obviously, principally on what should happen with that money, what should happen with the money that already exists. But how do you fight what they are trying to do with that money, or how do you use that wisely? Because at the end of the day, being in the minority, they're going to be the ones that call the shots in some form or fashion, but this is still money that belongs to the people. How are you an advocate for taxpayers in this specific situation?
Absolutely. Well, that's where the power of our voices gets out. So I have been utilizing social media. I have been utilizing other methods of going to the people to get the truth out, get the information out. Because in order to push their agenda, Democrats rely on their partners in media and academia to push their narrative, which is false. It's a false narrative on the premise of using fear and division. And so for us to get even though we're in a minority in the body, we are having our communications, we as a unified body delivering to the people the fact that the hardships are going to be the result of Democrat policies, not prosperity. That's number one. Number two, we're partnering with our Republican colleagues in the Senate who are in the majority. And it is because of our colleagues, our Republican majority, that we did not have terrible policies passed into law last year, such as gun control, such as paid family leave, which is another tax increase. It just goes on and on, the dramatically terrible policies that would have been put into place. But yes, getting our information out, and because people are receptive to the truth, and that's what we need to keep working on.
To that end, talking about this pot of money that the state is willing to spend or overextend itself in spending, tell me a little bit about the bonding bills that are in place, or what you hope to accomplish on some of the bonding issues in the state legislature this session.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, in my opinion, there is a legitimate use for bonding when it comes to statewide or a regional benefit. Right? So roads and bridges, there are state buildings like colleges and universities across the state of Minnesota that are owned by the state. And obviously we have a responsibility to pay for and ensure the upkeep, the maintenance of those buildings. That makes sense. If a new roof is needed, HVAC system, et cetera, right? That's a responsibility. It has to be repaired and maintained. But when it comes to local projects, that's what's incredibly frustrating, is that there are local municipalities all across the state of Minnesota, because they don't want to pay for their own projects, they have legislators that are willing to put in bills that are going to pay for purely local issues that don't have a statewide significance or regional significance.
So one of those, you had just made mention about states funding the projects of cities. And in some cases, it's pet projects. But in one really important case, we just had a news story this past week where one of your colleagues, Representative Matt Grossel, and Jacob Fry, were talking about police funding and the safety issues in Minneapolis. And there was a heated exchange between the two of them around this issue, because Minneapolis crime is going up. The police force is underfunded, and your caucus just had a press conference talking about an initiative to fund some of those efforts on behalf of the city. Can you tell us about some of those initiatives, Eric?
Absolutely. Well, as we've seen the headlines for the last several years now, both Minneapolis and St. Paul, leadership in those cities has turned away from supporting law enforcement. They've turned away from these different issues, and what has the result been? We've seen crime skyrocket. We've seen, in fact, there was a recent hearing on light rail transit, and where the employees of these light rail operators were giving their horror stories. And so crime is on the rise in these cities. It's because city leaders are focused on spending their money in other areas that are just completely outside of the purview of what government should be doing, right? Plastic straws, banning plastic bags, banning drive-throughs in their cities. It's just amazing where they're spending their money. It's coming at a cost of the safety and the security of law-abiding citizens. And so we as Republicans, we recognize that we need to ensure the safety of all people, right? We care about the safety and security, and so that's what the press conference was about, is to enact some provisions that are going to help law enforcement, because we as Republicans are obviously pro-law enforcement. We're pro-law-abiding citizens, and that's what we're looking. That's what the press conference was all about.
And I do think you bring up a good point insofar as the cities themselves are economic hubs of our state, and people want to visit them. People want to go to Twins games and Wild games and Wolves games. What are some specific initiatives that you guys are kind of proposing for the police forces in Minneapolis in this case?
Well, I wasn't at that press conference, so I don't have the specifics of some of those bills.
Yeah.
But just overall, it's going to be a focus on supporting law enforcement, supporting the needs. They've had requests in to their mayors, to their city councils, to increase the number of officers that are supporting those services within the city. And unfortunately, we've seen the mayors, and that's what the spat was over from Mayor Fry.
Yeah.
He's just in denial of all-out reality. And so, again, I don't have the details of the bills in front of me. My understanding is there was 5 separate bills, separate initiatives that are going to, again, be pro-law enforcement and to ensure those, whether you live in the metro or whether you live outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul and you come to the metro to engage in whatever it is you're going to do in the city to ensure that you're safe.
Seems like every session we have some ridiculous proposals on gun control. And some of these are weather balloons to see how far they can go. I know that a lot of it is posturing at the very beginning, but I think a lot of it is an indicator if there is a full majority in the Senate, a full majority in the House, and the governorship, this is what they are going to pursue. I'm wondering, Eric, what are you seeing on the ground about what they're proposing, what might be different this session, and how extreme some of these Democrats have gotten on the other side?
Well, despite the fact that the Democrats, led by Governor Walz, are pushing this narrative of one Minnesota, that's what they're pushing.
Yes.
It is flat out false. That's not what they're doing. That's what they're saying out of their mouth, but that's not the actions they're taking. They're clearly being governed by the metro-centric extremist radicals. And so, if you recall last year, there's 2 gun control bills that they were pushing, red flag gun confiscation orders and universal background checks. Those did not pass as standalone bills off the House floor for a very good reason. Because there were 9 outstate rural Democrats that did not support that. Because Minnesotans clearly understand law-abiding citizens are not those that are committing these heinous acts of evil.
Right.
And so increasing gun control on the backs of law-abiding citizens is going to do absolutely zero to increase safety. And so rural Democrats recognize that. And so, but unfortunately, the Metro Democrats, they don't care about the truth.
Right.
They don't care about truth. They care about their ideology because big government control is their religion. And that's how they're being led, and they didn't pass it. It was only able to be passed off the House floor as part of an omnibus bill.
Right.
And so what I'm going to be continue to doing is highlighting this truth, and let's hope that those 9 stay strong.
What I find interesting about that dynamic of metro versus rural Democrats is it seems as their numbers dwindle in outstate Minnesota, they begin overall to just care less and less about whatever outstate Minnesota thinks about. And there's,
you know what, we just saw former majority or minority leader Bach.
Yeah, Tom Bach.
Right? He's, what was it, a decade?
Yes.
Rural Iron Range member. And the metro-centric radicals in the Senate Democrat caucus, they overthrew him. They couldn't handle it anymore.
Right.
So
right.
yeah, we're seeing that consolidation of power in the metro area.
And there's 2 sides of that coin, right? There's the side that says, okay, well, we can appeal as Republicans to outstate Minnesotans who have more what you'll call conservative values, I think, inherently in the communities that they grow up in. So that's a plus. I think what really makes it difficult is this gives Democrats cover to be a little bit more unhinged and a little bit more driven in pursuing some of these bills. So as the influence of some of these outstate representatives decreases, my fear, Eric, is that some of these proposals will get a little bit more brazen and they'll pursue them with a little bit more vigor because they feel like they have that cover. Do you get that same sense, or do you think that they care about these nine Democrats, and it seems to me they probably don't?
Well, you're spot on. The more the power consolidates within the metro, the more influence they're going to have, within their caucus at least, with their radical proposals. And that's why it is our job as Republicans to get the truth out. And that's what we're doing. We're fighting within the House and the Senate for the truth, and we're getting the message out, and Minnesotans are recognizing this. That's the reason why we continue to see in rural Minnesota seats flip from Democrat to Republican. Decades-long seats. Right? We just saw it last year in the special session when the seat flipped to Jason Rarick in the special Senate seat. And that's just a recognition of that. And I firmly believe this next election later this year, we're going to see, I will not be surprised if we see 2 current Democrat seats in the Senate held by Democrats flipped to Republican. And yeah, I mean, that's because the people, the hardworking people in these rural parts of the state recognize that socialism and the agenda of the hardcore radical left is not what they want.
Let's take, just for a minute, I think we'll get back to session, but take for a minute, Eric, your legislator hat off and put your campaigning hat on. You just made mention that because of the dynamic of how radical Democrats are getting, metrocentric Democrats are getting, and in many cases throwing their colleagues under the bus who are in outstate Minnesota. How do you see this next year kind of playing out in Minnesota, both in your caucus from an election standpoint and then statewide? What does your gut feeling tell you? What do the people on the ground kind of tell you?
I hear nothing but positive energy. We're seeing from a national level, we're seeing influence and staffers come into the state from the President Trump reelection campaign. That is energizing the grassroots. We're seeing cooperation and working together with the state party, with the House Republican caucus, with the Senate Republican caucus, like we've never had integration, cooperation, and communication before. And all of these multi-level are in connection with the energy from the grassroots. Again, is going to be such, I think we're going to see things we haven't seen and completely unexpected, just as we saw in 2016 with President Trump's election. Great things are going to happen here in Minnesota. The message of constitutional values, individual liberty, is resonating with hardworking Minnesotans, and I think we're going to see the pendulum swing away from just the radical Democrats and their policy proposals.
One thing that I think kind of feeds into both the campaign side of what you do and the legislative side of what you do, because it's been a successful messaging platform for Republicans because it's a legitimate issue, is some of the waste, fraud, and abuse within the Department of Human Services in Minnesota. I know that's a huge concern for a lot of people who watch the show because we have millions and millions of dollars that we have no idea where it's going. I mean, in some cases, it's flying overseas and funding terrorism, from what we can tell. What are you doing at the House level and within your caucus, within the legislature, to address that specific issue? We still have people employed that should not be employed from DHS.
So we have confirmed over $100 million of waste, fraud, and abuse. Taxpayer dollars squandered and little to zero accountability. Governor Walz is where the buck stops. He is the executive branch. He leads the agency, right? And unfortunately, he has just not had the wherewithal or the interest to hold people to the fire. And you added that over $100 million and just that to the over $100 million squandered, taxpayer dollars squandered for MNLARS, right? A website and technology system developed by the state that was operational barely for 18 months or so and has been completely scrapped. Now we're talking over $200 million, right? And you add up all these other things, it is a significant chunk of change. And then at the same time, you have Democrats pushing for tax increases. So what are we doing? We are, well, in the minority, we can't bring bills forward, but again, we can fight for the truth. The truth of confirmed waste, fraud, and abuse. This is not just a talking point. These are third-party auditors that are confirming this stuff.
Well, I even think Auditor Jim Nobles, who is probably, I think most people regard one of the most objective guys in St. Paul, the hearing that I saw where he outlined some of the waste, fraud, and abuse in DHS was just one of the most excoriating, passionate speeches I've ever seen him give. This is objectively a bad thing. This is not a Republican thing. This is not a Democrat thing. How do we amplify that as Republicans? Not only for our electoral benefit, because I think that is part of it, but as this is your money. Democrats are calling, like you said, for tax increases, but this is your money that is being wasted. Is it a social media thing? Is it a floor speech thing? Eric, how do we get the message out?
All of the above, because we simply cannot rely on mainstream media. We know that they are complicit in granting cover for the Democrat Party. right? They're complicit in granting cover for these radicals. And so we can't count on them. So yes, it's exactly right. We have to rely on our own messaging. And that's the beauty of social media, is that we simply do an end run around the traditional gatekeepers. They used to hold the keys on what information got out and then what angle, what slant that information got out. But now they no longer hold the keys. They're no longer the gatekeeper. And we are utilizing social media. We're utilizing radio. We're utilizing all non-traditional forms. And that's why our message is winning.
You know, you had brought up something that I found very interesting, and I don't hear much about, and that is the buck stops with Tim Walz. In one man's opinion, since he has been governor, I feel like he has had cover from just about everything. I mean, from media to blame. He owns this. He owns MNLARS. He owns DHS. But in the case of DHS in particular, it was, you just heard about the Carolyn Ham, the inspector on it.
Yep.
And it seemed to the buck stopped with her. Why does he seem to get away already with everything?
Well, it's not just him. It's not just Governor Walz. It's Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Look at what she's gotten away with. And our local media just is incredibly lazy. They have zero interest in digging in and holding people to the fire, right? They're the fourth estate. They are being derelict in their responsibility of holding government accountable, getting information out. And so, yes, they're granting a pass to Governor Walz. They grant a pass to Congresswoman Omar. They grant a pass to Democrats right on down the board. And it's coming at not only, I don't know why, they think they're going to escape the consequences of not holding government accountable, because they are. They themselves as individuals and they themselves as institutions, because as institutions and individuals, the confidence has been completely eroded. They no longer have the credibility. And so these elected officials get away with it because they have a complicit media that's on their side.
You know, we had talked prior to taping today about a hearing that you have tomorrow, and I'm kind of interested because you don't hear about this topic too often. This topic of deepfakes and internet imitation and that kind of thing. You have a hearing on that tomorrow. What exactly are you tackling? On that front?
It's one that's incredibly important. So deepfake, also known as digital misrepresentation, it is the technology has advanced to the point where whether it be a digital image, whether a still image, whether it be a video or an audio recording, with the use of artificial intelligence, neural networks, machine learning, these pictures, audio files, and video files can be manipulated or completely manufactured to show that Max Reimer engaged in some activity that never happened.
Using my voice and
correct.
And my face
everything.
And my mannerisms.
Yep,
Wow.
Exactly. The way you walk, the filler words that we use, the facial expressions, to create a video of you standing behind a podium giving a speech of something that, not an event that you did and you gave a speech that they changed a few words, to completely manufacture something that never happened. Now imagine, with the use of this technology, and we see now that even our leaders, the president is utilizing Twitter.
Yes.
So imagine a fake video, 90 seconds long, of something that never happened, of the president saying, manufactured to say president is attacking Iran or whatever. And that gets out. It's released on social media. These other nations have to respond militarily, potentially, because they have seconds to respond or minutes to respond, depending on the scenario. And so there's a lot at risk here on a security perspective, but then also as individuals. It could be used for, it's an extreme form of revenge porn, for example.
Of course.
There's all kinds of scenarios. So it's not just public officials, it's private individuals that are susceptible and at risk. So what my bill is seeking to do is to begin to recognize this and put penalties on those that would engage in the act of digital misrepresentation with the intent to cause harm.
Fascinating. An initiative that I think for many of our viewers is probably a brand new concept, but in this digital age, it is like crazy.
Absolutely.
The amount of damage you can do. Getting back to the election with the final couple of minutes we have here, Eric, digitally, we'll be in time for caucus by the time that this broadcasts. On cable, we won't necessarily be there. But just from your perspective as an elected official, why is it important for Republicans to get out and caucus, even in an incumbent year like this?
Well, let's go back to the words of our founding father, Benjamin Franklin. What kind of government did you give us? A republic, if you can keep it. So to answer your question, why is it important that grassroots people, hardworking individuals, take time out of their life to be involved in the caucus? Mm-hmm. It's in order to preserve our republic. Because our Constitution, our republic is only going to be maintained if people are active, engaged, and fighting for our values, fighting to maintain our values and passing them on to the next generation so that they can enjoy the fruits of our great country as we've had.
Very good. Eric, with the final minute or so here, I always like to ask, because it's very easy when you're in the heat of an election, how people can kind of get involved and get engaged and that kind of thing. But how can people get engaged with, one, you and what you're doing legislatively, but in the legislature in general? How can people get engaged and be involved in the legislative process as you guys are actually cooking the stew of bills
Absolutely.
at the state capitol?
Well, I would say the easiest way would be to look up your House member and your Senate member and contact them. Now, if you happen to live in a district where you have a House or Senate member that's not doesn't align with your values, then find an elected representative that does align with your values. Reach out to them. Each of us has an email address. Each of us has a phone number. Mm-hmm. Contact our Capitol, and we will absolutely tell us the issues that you'd be interested in, and we will absolutely help you learn to come down to committee hearings, to help maybe contact chief authors and others of different bills that are both for and against a particular issue to help make your voice louder.
What is the one big thing you hope to see accomplished in this session? Something that'll make people's lives a little bit freer in Minnesota?
Tax cuts.
Tax cuts.
We have, going back to what we discussed earlier, we're overtaxed in the state. People are being crushed. People are fleeing Minnesota. They're taking their jobs with them. Job creators are taking their jobs with them. And we've seen a great migration. The 10 top states that are losing population, 7 of them are traditionally Democrat or blue leaning. We are one of them. People are leaving. We need to cut our taxes, become more business friendly here so we can retain our job creators.
Representative Eric Lucero, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely.
This has been the Republican Roundtable. I'm your host, Max Reimer. Until next time.